Hello and welcome. Today's training class is called Effective Interviewing and Selection for Maximum Returns. This class was designed specifically for supervisors and managers within the City of Berkeley to ensure that our policies are consistent. Thank you for joining us. Session objectives. By the end of this session, first of all, you will be able to plan an effective interview strategy. Secondly, you'll learn to develop solid job-related questions so you can really get to the bottom of what you're looking for in a candidate. Thirdly, we'll focus on the legal issues regarding hiring so we can avoid the possibility of discrimination. And overall, we'll learn to conduct successful interviews that are respectful, insightful, and effective. Starting from the big picture, we want to make sure that supervisors and managers understand why interviews are so important. First of all, they provide you with information you need to make the best hiring decisions. We also want to make sure that we evaluate candidates objectively. Sure, there's an element of subjectivity in our decision, but we have to make sure that it's based on fact and evidence. We want to hire the candidate that's the best fit for the job. Therefore, we need to ask good questions to really determine who the best fit for the job would be. So interviews are one of the most important functions of a supervisor or manager. And even if you're just participating on a panel, you have the opportunity to have your input heard and ensure that you obtain great coworkers. This training class is divided into 4 different sections. Section A is preparing for the interview. So first of all, logistics and how to set up your interview strategy, but more importantly, focusing on the questions to ask and questions to avoid that will get to the bottom of whether that candidate is going to be a good fit for this position. Section B focuses on the interview itself, how to build rapport, set the agenda, asking specific questions, and also probing to get better answers out of the questions that you do ask. Section C focuses on the legal issues you need to know about when you're conducting interviews and making selection decisions, including the federal and state laws you should know about, but also special considerations regarding ADA, FMLA, pregnancy disability, and other sort of special considerations. And then Section D focuses on the selection process, tracking your applicants and determining who the top candidate is, and also conducting the reference checking policy. So let's get into the first section, which is Section A, preparing for the interview, making sure that we are strategic about our interview process and not just sitting down and launching into random questions for the applicant. Here are some tips for reviewing the application forms. So presumably what you will get from the HR department is a stack of applications, including resumes and NeoGov applications, supplemental questions, and anything else pertaining to the hiring process. So we want to use the same criteria for screening the stack of applicants. We should identify the technical and behavioral aspects of the job and use those to screen and determine who we are going to bring in for interviews. In reviewing the application, we want to identify red flags. Examples of red flags could be big gaps in employment or titles that are vague or unclear. Things that we might want to ask in our follow-up with the applicant. Be sure you are systematic in your approach And just sort of go through the resumes and the applications and put them into different piles, maybe in A, B, and C, depending on how attractive they are to you as candidates. For more information on red flags and evaluation criteria, you might want to review pages 2 and 3 of the workbook. Since we've identified what our criteria are for determining who we're going to interview, we then want to get together a list of questions that we can ask each and every applicant in a systematic way. We want to make sure that our questions are based on the past experience of the applicant, because the past is the best predictor of the future. Our questions should ask about specific examples from their past jobs that indicate that they have that technical or behavioral skill that you're asking about. Make sure that your questions are open-ended so the applicant has a good opportunity to formulate an idea and articulate it to you. And if you don't like the answer that the applicant has provided you with, you can certainly probe for a better answer. Sometimes applicants have very rehearsed answers, or they don't fully understand the question and they provide you with a less than useful example. But don't probe more than one question. So we want to develop a list of questions before the interview, and these questions will be asked of each and every applicant, so we can be systematic in our approach. There are 2 rules for the questions that we should develop. First of all, we should ask questions which focus on the applicant's past performance, again, because past performance is the best indicator of what they will do in the future. Secondly, we want to ask questions that relate directly to the job requirements that are listed in the job posting. So that means the technical requirements of the job as well as the behavioral aspects of the job. When drafting your list of questions, make sure you ask questions about technical and behavioral aspects of the job. Technical aspects would be computer skills, organizational skills, licenses, certifications that they have, whereas behavioral aspects would be things like teamwork, communication, taking initiative, creativity, problem solving, conflict resolution. These are all important aspects of being successful on any job. It's okay to ask about what they currently do as well as what they have done in the past, but try to stay out of the future. A good way to start a question would be, in your current position, how do you determine how to resolve customer complaints, for example? Asking a question about the future will only give you a hypothetical answer to a hypothetical question. Another good way to start a question would be, tell me about a time when you had to design a new software program, for example. The way this question is phrased will provide you with a real-life example of what they've done in the past. Another example might be, give me an example of a time when you had to challenge a management decision. How did you resolve that situation? If you look at the back of the binder, the workbook, you'll see a lot of questions that have been designed specifically for behavioral issues such as teamwork, initiative, problem solving, and other related behavioral issues. Once you've figured out what your questions are going to be, you might want to type it up, print it out, and laminate it, or at least leave it at each place so when the applicant comes in, they are advised that you're going to ask each and every applicant the same questions. That's really helpful. Secondly, the applicant can look down at that list of questions to sort of figure out and prompt their memory about what kind of questions you ask, and hopefully that'll assist them in coming up with a better answer. And then thirdly, it can keep you on track so you don't allow the applicant to veer off into subjects that are not on your list of prepared questions. Okay, let's get into section B, which is actually conducting the interview, developing rapport, going through your list of prepared questions, and some of the do's and don'ts about conducting the interview. First of all, be prepared when you're conducting the interview. Review the person's application that's coming in, even if you're familiar with them. A lot of times internal candidates assume that you know all there is to know about them, but in fact they have much more to share that's on their NeoGov application or their resume. You should be prepared to discuss the applicant's background, interests, career goals, etc. You can ask some specific questions of an individual applicant, but make sure you're as consistent as possible. So again, the City of Berkeley process is to develop a list of questions in advance, focusing on sort of 4 or 5 criteria, but I would say there's probably only the opportunity to get through maybe 10 questions in a 45-minute period. Your questions should really focus on what the job is all about, the classification specifications, but also think about the needs of the division or the department now and into the future. Ensure that the work assignment is appropriate for this applicant. Sometimes people get on the list when they don't exactly know where the work assignment is located, the hours of work, or location. So confirm that that's a good match. Really focus on the critical characteristics that are required for success. Again, it's not just the technical skills or the behavioral skills, because we have to have a balance. The applicant should have the technical skills if they're on the minimum qualifications list, but they also need to be a good fit for the department from a behavioral standpoint. Be sure that the room you've selected has a certain amount of privacy, so you can conduct the interview in a confidential manner. And also minimize interruptions. Turn off your phone. One suggestion I do have is to not schedule interviews back to back. I think most interviews last about 45 minutes to an hour, so allow yourself some time and a break between interviews to debrief if it's a panel interview, and also to take some notes or document the interview so you can wrap up one interview before you move on to the next person. It's more respectful, more organized. A couple of notes about setting up panel interviews, and they can be very effective in terms of getting input from staff about their potential coworkers, but make sure that the positions are appropriate. So it should be other managers, supervisors, some external panelists, but peers of the position might not be appropriate to be on the panel. One point to note is that City of Berkeley employees who are on the qualified list may contact any supervisor or manager for an interview, and they are entitled to that interview. Moving on to the interview itself, remember that first impressions count, and your job as an interviewer is also of a recruiter. So you want to obviously present the best first impression as a potential manager or supervisor. Introduce yourself confidently, using strong body language, a nice handshake, and consider the message that you're sending to the possible applicant. In meeting people, it's important to understand the importance of body language. And so there's a great study that's done by Albert Mehrabian. He's at UCLA, and he wrote a book called Silent Messages. He says that body language, posture, vocal patterns account for about 93% of your ability to communicate. So the importance of your body language and the vocal patterns, the pace of your voice, the pitch of your voice can't be underestimated. So to start out the interview, we want to treat our applicants like honored guests. We want to start out with a simple question that we can ask them, a simple icebreaker that gets them talking, gets them comfortable, and allows us to build that rapport. So some simple icebreakers might be the type of organization that you've worked in the past, geographic area that you've been living or working, something off their application or resume that caught your attention, or other safe but not really job related question about the weather or traffic might be okay to ask. Basically, what you want to try to do is get the applicant talking, becoming comfortable, developing that rapport, and you will see that the barriers to communication break down, the applicant becomes comfortable and gives you more. So it's really important for the applicant to feel comfortable. One of the things you want to avoid are personal questions or comments. So a question like, tell me a little bit about yourself, might seem innocuous, but in fact, you're asking the applicant to tell you about their life, their decisions, their habits, marital status, and other various protected information. So basically, you're trying to get the applicant to talk and become comfortable. And to do that, you want to make sure that you start out appropriately and introduce yourself and the role that you play at the organization, and also introduce other panelists that are participating in the interview. Next, you'll want to focus on the main points of the job if this hasn't been covered already. So for example, a person might have applied for a job on the OS2 list, but this job specifically has different hours, a specific location, and a different focus. So make sure you cover that in the beginning of the interview. As I mentioned before, you might want to comment that you're going to ask the same questions for each and every applicant. This tells the applicant that you are systematic, you are focused, and it's really a fair and consistent approach to the interview process. Next, tell the applicant that you will allow for questions after all of your questions have been answered. So say something like, after my questions, I'll give you the opportunity to ask me some questions, so they know to save their questions to the very end. Let them know the interview should last about 45 minutes. And then go ahead and get started if everyone's ready to go. Now you're ready to get started with your interview. A couple of do's and don'ts before we get started is, first of all, control the interview. Stick to your agenda. And your agenda is basically the set of questions that you developed in advance that will guide your discussions with the applicant. Listen to the answers that the applicant provides you with and allow them to elaborate. Don't ask a question on top of the initial question that you asked. It's just confusing and gets the applicant flustered. Ask probing questions. Now this might be different than you've learned in the past, but basically it's okay to ask one probing question, but any more might be a little bit too much. So if someone doesn't provide you with a specific answer that you were looking for or enough detail, a follow-on question is appropriate. Throughout the interview, you should nod, encourage, and prompt the applicant as needed to ensure that they are participating and you've developed that rapport that's so important. Again, don't forget about your nonverbals while you're watching the nonverbals and the body language of the applicant. And don't forget to pace the interview. You've got a set of questions that you've developed in advance, and you need to get through all of those questions for each and every applicant. So make sure that you're staying on pace and you are getting through the questions you've prepared in advance. One last thing is that you want to end on a positive note and use this as an opportunity to really thank the employee or the applicant for coming in, spending time, showing an interest in the job, and let them know you really appreciate their participation in the interview process. One final note is that we want to make sure that the applicant feels appreciated and that they are treated in a respectful and professional way at all times. In terms of interviewing don'ts, one of the things you want to avoid is to not ask personal questions. There are protected categories that we can't delve into, and we have to make sure that employees don't feel like we are invading their privacy. Also, don't allow superficial impressions to influence your decision, such as what they're wearing, their handshake, some initial response that they give to a question you ask. Make sure that you remain open-minded. Also, don't make any promises that they're perfect for the job or ask them a question like, when can you start? This would give the applicant the wrong impression. And certainly don't ask any discriminatory questions about anyone's protected category, which is in the section following. Now we're into section C, which is legal issues. And I want to point out that there are legal issues associated with every step along the way of the recruiting process, from job postings to screening to interview questions to selection, and we want to make sure that we're in complete compliance with the law. Therefore, you need to know a lot about a lot of laws that are out there based on federal laws as well as state laws. This section will give you a sense of the federal and state laws you need to know about in order to avoid issues with the law. First of all, let's talk about the federally protected categories having to do with discrimination law. The law that was sort of started the civil rights movement in the 1960s was called Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This law initially protected people in various groups such as race, sex, color, religion, national origin, ethnicity, and ancestry. After that point in time, several other laws were passed that created similar protected categories, such as a law protecting discrimination based on age. That law was called the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, and it protects people who are over the age of 40. An additional law was passed protecting women who are pregnant or have related medical conditions, such as inability to become pregnant, fertility issues, or pregnancy itself. That law brought us to the 1990s, and in the 1990s a big law was passed called the Americans with Disabilities Act, protecting people with physical or mental disabilities and ensuring that the workplace was open to people with disabilities. Also, a law called the Immigration Reform and Control Act requires us to verify eligibility and authorization to work, but it also prohibits discrimination on the basis of citizenship status. Union membership is protected based on the National Labor Relations Act, and military status is also a protected category based on the Uniformed Services Employment and Reemployment Rights Act. Also, it's important to note that any time an employee receives benefits to which they're entitled, such as workers' comp, FMLA, EEO claims, or any other legal entitlements, they are protected. Now, on the state level, since California is a very progressive state, we have a lot of laws that protect California employees, and one of the issues is the family situation. So we cannot discriminate on the basis of marital status, dependents, or domestic partners. Also, we cannot discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. Of course, these issues have nothing to do with a person's ability to do the job, so they shouldn't be considered in any employment decision. Another protected category in California is political affiliation, so we shouldn't ask any questions having to do with political affiliation or interest or party affiliation. In the state of California, Section 132A prohibits discrimination and retaliation based on workers' compensation benefits, and so we cannot ask about any workers' compensation benefits an employee may have received or use that information to determine whether we're going to hire them or not. Ancestry is also a protected category in the state of California, so we shouldn't ask any questions about what kind of last name is that, how did you learn that language, those sort of things. Membership in a union is also protected by state law as well as federal law. And a big issue in California is medical conditions. So we have all sorts of laws having to do with HIV positive protections, having cancer, and genetic factors. And so it's very important that we consider medical information to be highly confidential and not ask any questions about it nor include any information about it in our discussions with a person unless they have a need to know. Non-professional affiliations would also be a protected category in the state of California, so we shouldn't ask about any private clubs or groups that an employee is associated with. And we also need to take steps to ensure the confidentiality of private financial information, and certainly not ask questions about their financial situation in an interview. Also, arrest records are protected in the state of California, and in fact there's current legislation pending regarding banning the box, meaning you can't ask at all about any criminal background of an employee. There's a Department of Fair Employment and Housing handout in your materials. You should take a look at that and be very familiar with the types of questions you can and cannot ask. Basically, we want to ensure that all of our questions are consistent and job related. The minute we're inconsistent about any step along the way of our hiring process, the case could be made that that's unfair and potentially unlawful. And so in order to stay in the green area, we want to make sure that we are fair and consistent in every step. Also see additional examples in your workbook. Now, one of the special considerations you need to be aware of is with the Americans with Disabilities Act, and a couple of points to highlight. First of all, the employer may not ask disability-related questions or conduct medical examinations until after they have made a conditional job offer to an applicant. And in fact, employers have an obligation to make reasonable accommodations to enable applicants with disabilities to participate in the interview process. Also, employers cannot ask whether an applicant has a physical or mental impairment, has received workers' compensation, or was ever addicted to illegal drugs. If it's a known disability, for example, an employee comes in a wheelchair or they note it to you, you can ask how we can accommodate the disability, but you cannot ask about how they became disabled or what the prognosis or diagnosis of the disability is. So a lot of times an applicant might raise the issue that they have a need that needs to be accommodated. For example, they had FMLA in the past, or they had a past pregnancy or a current pregnancy, or they have a current disability. If these issues come up, don't get nervous or rattled, just handle it as a normal sort of issue. Secondly, you might want to just sort of put a lid on it, meaning to firmly indicate. If they ask for an accommodation, you might want to state that if you are selected, you can work with the HR department. And if they bring up childcare, you might just want to indicate to the applicant that childcare or your pregnancy plans won't be used to determine our hiring decisions. Just make it very clear to the applicant that that issue will not enter into any decision. To avoid any legal trouble, we want to make sure that we treat applicants respectfully at all times. That's fundamental to the relationship that you have with an applicant. Secondly, we want to be consistent, because the minute we are inconsistent, someone could say that that was unfair and perhaps discriminatory. But if we are following through on all of our hiring practices and procedures, we should have no opportunity for being inconsistent. Another thing you want to consider is to not make decisions until all candidates have been evaluated and tested in a systematic manner. We have great HR plans and strategies for conducting interviews, and we basically just need to follow through on those policies, as well as reference checking and verifying backgrounds of all the candidates. So as we wrap up the interview, again, this is our last opportunity to thank them sincerely, be positive, end the interview on a positive note. Even if they didn't get the job, they will have had a good experience in interviewing with the City of Berkeley. So thank them sincerely, be positive, and also let them know the next steps, what the process is going to be, what the timing is going to be, and how to expect a reply back via email or phone or what have you. And then finally, don't make any promises or give the applicant any indication that they got the job. It's important to follow through on our processes and strategy that we set up in advance. So to wrap up the legal issues section, I wanted to make sure everyone understood that there is a handout in your materials, which is produced by the Department of Fair Employment and Housing, and it has a list of questions that employers can ask and questions that would be inappropriate to ask in an interview. Most of the ones that have been covered in this training class are pretty obvious, but just to highlight certain issues, you don't want to ask about race, sex, color, religion, national origin, ethnicity, ancestry, age, disability, pregnancy, military status, union membership, any protected category that we talked about earlier in this presentation. With specific regard to military status, you cannot ask about military reservist obligations and what kind of discharge the person had from the military, but any job-related questions are fine. Take a look at that handout in your workbook and make sure that you are comfortable with the prohibited inquiries under EEO and California state law. Now we're at section D, which is the selection process. And hopefully the interviews have provided you with insight to make a selection about the top candidate or candidates. You may want to interview some of the candidates a second time, depending on the circumstances, and then eventually you will get to a top candidate that you're going to check their references and do background checks on. So this section will cover that process. First of all, there is a tool that can assist you in tracking all of your applicants. It's called the Tracking Form tool that's in your workbook. And basically you start out with A1, which is the first person that you meet. When you meet the second person and interview them, they may or may not be better than the first person that you tracked. So you can put them in either B1 or B2. And then you follow this form along until you get to the end of the day, the end of the week, whatever it is, with a ranking of all your top applicants. This is a form that you can use. You don't have to use it. It's just a tool that can provide you with a way to track the applicants that you are meeting and interviewing. Another form you can use, which is in your workbook, is the reference checking form. Now, the City of Berkeley policy is to check references on the top candidate only, but we have to ensure that we are being consistent about our reference checking policy. So we have to ask for the current supervisor and 2 other people with direct working experience of that applicant. So in your interview or as a follow-up phone call, you can say we're checking references. In order to move forward in the hiring process, we have to talk to a current supervisor and 2 other people with direct knowledge of your experience. Forget about personal references. We're really just concerned with people who have a sense of the professional background of the applicant. Before checking references, ensure that the candidate is comfortable with us calling them. So a lot of times the applicant might not be comfortable with you calling their current supervisor. If that's the case, call HR, talk to them about it, and they will work with you to ensure that we are following through on the consistent reference checking policy. And so we realize that this is sort of a double-edged sword, whereas most organizations' policy is to refer you to HR, or they'll only confirm name, dates of employment, and title. But hopefully you can get more information out of the people that are provided to you as references. You might want to email them in advance and say that we're moving forward in the hiring process with this applicant, and we would like to talk to you about a couple of different questions we have about their background, and hopefully they'll be willing to talk to you. Again, the form is in your workbook and you can use it if you'd like to, but there's no reason that you need to submit that back to HR. So that brings us to the end of this presentation. One of the key points I wanted to highlight was that interviews are an essential part of the hiring process, but it doesn't end there. We have to make sure that we integrate, assimilate, orient our staff, and ensure that they are successful starting on the job day 1. When we talked about the questions, we want to focus on competency-based questions, questions that are focused on not just the technical skills of the job, but also the behavioral aspects of the job, keeping in mind the things that are important, such as teamwork, conflict resolution, working in a diverse community. These are all essential parts of the success of working in the city of Berkeley. We also want to ensure that we are avoiding discriminatory questions and judgments, some of the preconceptions or unconscious bias that people have in the interviewing process. We want to be open-minded, clearly, and avoid questions that are discriminatory on their face. If we are fair and respectful, we probably won't have an issue in the first place, but we want to reiterate that respect goes a long way to ensuring that our applicants and our current employees that are working their way through a career position have an opportunity to be considered for promotional opportunities. Preparing for an interview is key. Do your strategy, develop your questions, put your questions out in advance so the applicant knows that they are going to be asked the same questions that any other applicant is going to be asked. And, just enjoy the process. This is a really good opportunity for you to meet a possible coworker or subordinate, and it should be a good way of developing rapport and trying to determine whether this person is going to fit the department and this position. If you have any questions, call HR. They are more than willing to help with your process, with your strategy, with supplemental questions, or if you have any questions regarding any step along the way of the interviewing process.